So back then we didn't have the printing press. You couldn't print off a book. So how did they record the things that had happened and what they'd known about?
People walked around talking. People could speak to eyewitnesses. Jesus' family and friends talked about him, and all that was gradually written down. This will just give you some examples. In those days, they didn't have paper, as you say, they didn't have printing. They wrote on papyrus from Egypt, made by pasting together, really, strips of the stalk of the papyrus plant which grew in Egypt. It was then made into a long roll like this,
Right.
and the valuable works were copied by scribes by hand, but very carefully. And later on during the Christian era, because the texts were so valuable and often they wanted to read them together, they were copied into little books called codices. Here's an example. This isn't an ancient codex, it's a copy, but it gives you an example of sort of books that were written. So we do know that biblical texts were copied. They were copied carefully over a period of several hundred years. Well, we do have quite a number of fragments, or even larger pieces, of biblical manuscripts from the early years. Here's an example. This one's a copy. It's a text written from 1 Corinthians around the 2nd century AD, the passage where Paul talks about Jesus' appearance after his resurrection. But even more excitingly, we do have an original one here in our museum, which we'll show you shortly.
So how many of these do we still have?
Oh, no, Carl, we'd have between 100 and 200 texts of different books of the Bible dating from around the 2nd century to, say, the end of the 4th century.
Now, you've said you have an ancient fragment from the New Testament. Can we have a look at that?
Yes, it's very exciting. In fact, I bought it in Vienna over 30 years ago now. My colleague Don Barker will show it to you.
Hi, Don. So what have you got to show us?
Well, we've got an ancient manuscript of the New Testament. This is a fragment from the Acts of the Apostles, dated around about in the 200s AD, and it comes from Acts chapter 2, Peter's speech on the day of Pentecost, and on this side it's the Peter's healing of the lame man at the temple.
So what does this tell us about whether we can trust the New Testament?
Well, it tells us that the Acts of the Apostles is a very old book, firstly. Secondly, it also helps us with working out what the original text of the Acts of the Apostles in this part was like. Authenticates really what we know today about the New Testament in this part of the Acts of the Apostles.
So what did we learn at Macquarie University with Professor Alana Nobbs? Well, we learned that you could trust the story of Christmas, that it did actually happen. It's a true event. But what difference does it make? Does it actually change people's lives? How does it impact the world today? We're in Melbourne in the city's financial district. Professor Ian Harper works for Access Economics, but we haven't come here to discuss economics. For years, Ian had nothing to do with the Bible or the Christian meaning behind Christmas.
G'day, Carl.
Hi, Ian, how you doing?
Oh, really well, Carl. How are you?
Great.
Good.
Tell us what you do here, Ian.
Yeah, we're consulting economists, Carl. That means we write reports on economic issues for various clients, including governments and business.
This show's about Christmas. Tell us, what does Christmas mean for you?
Yeah, well, look, for 30 years of my life, Christmas was a family gathering, but there was a very special occasion in my life when Christmas took on special meaning for me. I went to a church school. My father was actually quite hostile to religion, but he had been to the school and he sent myself and my two brothers there. So I had a sort of introduction to formal Christianity at school.
So did you believe it?
I don't think I really understood the message at that time. I enjoyed the hymns and we went to chapel every day, but I don't know that I really ever understood the main message of Christianity, but I didn't find it objectionable. And then one day, more or less out of the blue, my wife said, "I've become a Christian and I want to go to church." Well, you could have knocked me over with a feather. People might think, well, look, I'd be neutral to that at best, but I really wasn't. I was quite hostile because she'd had no religious upbringing at all, and I had been to school, to an Anglican school, so I figured I knew about this, and I also knew that it could tie you down and could become quite a burden. We had a small family at that stage, and she wanted us to go to church every Sunday, and I thought, oh, no, you don't.
So why did you go?
Well, in the end, she sort of put down the gauntlet and said, look, I'm really serious about this. I intend to raise our sons as Christians and I intend to go to church and you can do what you like.
So how did you decide which one to choose?
Well, I loved my wife, and I still do, and faced with that, I guess I hadn't really appreciated just how serious she was. And once she said that, and this is a woman, if you knew her, who had never really come at me in quite that way, so I knew this was serious stuff. Faced between my marriage and going to church, well, I mean, I go to church, okay? But it wasn't a commitment to that, it was just, all right, let's go to church.
After the break, we'll find out what made Christmas Day such an important event in Ian's life.